Hello and welcome to another Astranti bite-size video. Today we're looking at something, the product life cycle, that's taken from an E1 video. Now you may think, oh, I'm a student, I'm above the E1 level, but in fact the product life cycle is something that's used repeatedly throughout the CIMA syllabus, all up the levels and in all the case studies as well. So it's something that even if you remember, that it might be really useful to familiarize yourself with, because this serves as a really useful introduction to it and the strategies associated with the different stages of it. Now, as I said, it's taken from an E1 video. If you want to access the full tuition video, please visit our website, and of course there's different videos for all the different subjects associated with the CIMA syllabus on the Astranti website, so check it out if you find this useful. But as I said, this video is about the product life cycle. In this section, I'm gonna ask a kind of sensible question, which is, what is a life cycle? That may be something you would expect to be answered in this product life cycle section. But before we get to that, I'm going to ask you a question that perhaps you weren't expecting, and that's, what's your best strategy for getting through the day alive? Now, that seems like a strange question to be asking at the beginning of product life cycle section, but it all ties into life cycle. So let's imagine for a baby, what's the baby's best strategy for getting through the day alive? Well, for them, it's crying. Because if they do enough crying and screaming and yelling, eventually someone's going to come along and feed them or look after them or help them go to sleep. Now, if you're a fully mature adult, then that strategy of crying and yelling is probably not going to work. So the baby's strategy and the adult strategy are different. In fact, the adult strategy is far more likely to be to drive safely, to keep fit and not start any fights. The strategy totally depends on where you are in your life cycle, and that's exactly what we're going to be looking at. We're going to apply this analogy to both individual products, so perhaps for the market for a particular model of mobile phone, and the industries as a whole, so the entire mobile phone market. Now, we can use this analogy for both products and industries as a whole. So the strategy of perhaps a particular product in a market or the industry as a whole goes through different life cycle stages. And just like with a baby and an adult, different strategies are appropriate in each stage of the life cycle. So once we've identified where the industry or the product is in the life cycle, an organization can use that assessment to predict competitive conditions and formulate relevant strategies in the product life cycle. So let's go down and see the product life cycle. And here we go. We've got on our left hand side, we've got our sales, and along the bottom axis we've got our time. So here we go. There's a time, there's a sales, just to make it nice and clear. And you can see here we've got different stages: development, introduction, growth, maturity, and decline. That's the kind of stage that I think I'm at the moment. And what we're going to go through is look at each of these different stages for a particular product and see how the strategies change depending on which stage of the product life cycle the product is in. So let's have a brief overview of how the product life cycle works. So we start with development. So this is when an organization has been investing in the research of a product and they've researched their customer needs, and so then they're finally ready to introduce their product into the market. Now, the product is really good. Consumers find that it really works for them. Other consumers recognize this, and so new customers are gained and revenues grow. This is the growth stage of the market. Then the market reaches saturation and the product becomes more mature and the revenues level off, just as we've seen here. So we can see, don't we, there's nothing in development for sales. Introduction, the sales start to rise. Growth, there's a real steep rise in sales. Then maturity, the market's becoming saturated and their sales are leveling off. And then after another period of time, remember we're going a long time at the bottom here, the product is overtaken by development, perhaps by other competitors, and the introduction of new superior products. So the sales of this particular product go into its decline, and eventually it's withdrawn from market, which is this big void here. So we've got development, introduction, growth, maturity, and decline. That's the basis of our product life cycle. Now we're going to look at the strategies for each of those sections in more detail in a second, but firstly I want to talk about life cycle costing. Now in the product life cycle graph we've just looked at, we can see that sales are represented by the top line and profits by the bottom line. Now profits tend to be greatest at the maturity stage, where sales are highest, as we can see, and costs have been minimized through economies of scale and learning over time. Now the finance function works with sales and marketing before and during the entirety of a product's life cycle to make sure that all the costs are covered and it remains profitable. So let's have a look at the stages and the costs associated with those stages. So first off, our first stage of the life cycle is development. We're not selling any in the development because it's not been introduced to the market yet, but we do of course have costs. I mentioned some in our example. We've got research and development. So for example, you might be employing design staff to work on the product, and then you can have prototype manufacturing costs. Now this is not an exhaustive list of all the costs associated in the development stage. It's just to give you an idea. And also just interesting to note, there's no sales. Yeah, there are costs. Then we move on to our next stage, which is introduction. So we knew from our graph we've got very low levels of sales at the moment because the product's just been introduced to the market. Now we've got high fixed costs such as factory overhead, labor costs. And then we move on to our growth stage, and suddenly we've got a rapid increase in sales volume, and we've got variable costs, well, an increase in variable costs as production increases. So for example, direct and indirect labor costs, as well as increased fixed costs. Then we move on to the maturity stage, where we've got high and stable sales volume, and then here it's mostly variable costs, unless any non-current assets are needed. And then finally we've got our decline, falling demand in sales, decrease in variable costs and fixed costs, because now the organization may be starting to decommission the factories and withdrawing the product from production. So there we go. That's a little chart just to give you an idea of what the finance function has to monitor through a product's life cycle, and obviously trying to make sure the sales covers the costs. And of course, in some stages, got to make sure the organization has the resources to cover the costs. Okay, let's go back to our chart now. We're going to look at each stage of the product life cycle in more detail. So here we go. We've got up all the different stages. We've got development, then we've got our introduction, then we've got our growth, then maturity, then decline. So let's begin with product development. So in developing new products, organizations tend to go through set stages. So what we're going to do is review each of those stages. So number one, we've got our idea generation. So this is the idea for the product, and this may come about through market research as well as understanding customer needs and desires. So finding a gap in the market and then filling that gap with a new product. The next stage, number two, is screening. And this is a high-level review to rule out any infeasible ideas, considering market demands or customer needs, the competition, technical feasibility, and the likely profitability of the product. Then we move on to step 3 of product development, which is idea testing. So this is testing the concept with potential customers. So answers and reactions are noted so as to further improve the concept. Then we move on to step 4, which is business analysis. This is when the organization decides on the selling price, the demand, and the likely profitability of the product. How well is it going to perform for the business? Then the business moves on to beta testing and market testing. So this is all about testing the prototype of the product with consumers, making sure there is a prototype and it works, and then of course rolling any feedback back into the product to make any adjustments if necessary. Then we move on to the technical implementation, so designing the production process and setting up the operations so that it can be produced efficiently. Then we move on to commercialization. This is when the product is launched, advertised and manufactured. And then we have a product and pricing review. So this is all about reviewing the product and the prices as time progresses. So perhaps because of changes in position in the product life cycle or any new competitors entering the market. Now, you've probably noticed that stages 7 and 8 are launch and post-launch, and are starting to merge in with the next stages of the product life cycle, whereas steps 1 to 6 are all before the introduction to the market. So there we go. There's our 8 stages to product development. Let's move along now to our next stage of the product life cycle, and that's price skimming. So in the introduction stage, significant costs are incurred because the product, as we've seen, is being developed, still being developed, and obviously there's lots of money to be spent on marketing. And as we've also seen, sales volumes are often low at this introductory stage. So to combat this, an organization may use a price skimming strategy. Now, in a price skimming strategy, a high initial price is charged to capitalize on early adopters who often purchase new products, or perhaps they are a market who has a highly specific need, and so they're willing to pay more for the product. Now, as demand decreases for the product, then the price can be gradually decreased or skimmed, and that will attract more consumers to the product. To get you a real-world example of this, let's think about the introduction of Apple's iPod in 2001. Now, at the time, it was a revolutionary product that, combined with the iTunes Music Store, introduced the concept of portable digital music. Apple had a first-mover advantage and could operate a price-skimming strategy, charging a very high price for the iPod and setting the price of legal download sales for the entire industry. Now, of course, some people wanted just to have part of this iPod. They were like, yeah, we want the new thing, and so were happy to pay the more expensive price. Okay, let's move on to our next stage now, which is growth and market penetration. So we saw from our chart earlier on that in the growth stage, the product sales rise. Now, competitors begin to be attracted into the market because they're thinking, hold on a minute, this product's doing really well. Why don't we try and get some of that market? So as a result, the typical strategy followed in this section of the product life cycle is market penetration. This is where prices are lowered and marketing is increased. And so the aim of this is to try to win market share. Now, the aim here is to win market share and to try to become one of the leading players in the market. Now, often at the end of this growth stage, there's something called the shakeout, as you can see on screens. Now, this is where the least successful entrants pull out of the market, perhaps because they're not making much money, or perhaps they've been acquired by larger competitors who are trying to increase their market share. Now, a market penetration policy throughout the growth stage helps to avoid the organization being one of the losers during the shakeout. And if we think back to our Apple iPod example again, there are a flurry of competitors in both the MP3 hardware market as well as the online digital music store market in the early 2000s, as they were attracted by the iPod's success. Now, new entrants entered the market such as Amazon and Google. Competition came in the MP3 market, with most electronics manufacturers making their own versions. I think I'd bought a Sony, I can't even remember the name of it now, and that soon went out of production because it just wasn't as successful. So that fell out in the shakeout stage. Okay, after the growth stage, we're moving on to our maturity, and that's where we introduce a consolidation strategy. Because there's been a shakeout, there's suddenly fewer competitors in the market, and so the remaining competitors have to continue to consolidate their position. Now, they can do this by differentiating their products so that they're occupying a unique position in the market, or perhaps they're going to develop strong brands that are well known and trusted by consumers so they continue to attract customers. Now, in a consolidation strategy, prices are set at levels which are competitive but profitable. The lower production costs at this stage, due to the economies of scale caused by high volumes, means that the organization can remain profitable at this stage. Now, in this maturity stage, the finance function's interaction with sales and marketing would form part of portfolio management. Products that have reached this stage of the life cycle may require further marketing investment so as to keep sales at a profitable level. If an organization has multiple products at this stage, the costs of keeping them in maturity could escalate. And so, to avoid this, the finance function can work with sales and marketing to decide whether products and services should be moved into the decline stage, which then means investment can be freed up for products at this maturity stage. So, for example, when the market for MP3 players and download stores shook out, Apple were the dominant force. Amazon and to some extent Google were in the music download market, but small by comparison, while only brandless, low-cost commodity offerings were really successful in the MP3 market, with many leading brands shaken out by the dominance of Apple, just as I spoke about on my Sony. In this stage, we saw the price of the iPods come down so as to consolidate their position. Okay, and now we move on to the sad stage, the decline, the niche, the harvest, or the divest. So here, sadly, sales are starting to decline, but there are a range of possible strategies available, and the first is niche, and this is all about developing the product for a specific market segment who would continue to have a need for this product, and the organization could sell to them at a higher price because this need is being fulfilled really well. That's one strategy, offering it to a specific niche. We've also got another strategy, which is harvest. This is all about keeping costs as low as possible and continuing to sell, making profits for as long as sales continue. So just trying to harvest what the organization has done by keeping costs as low, because of course if they're keeping costs as low as possible, they're either able to increase their profit margins or pass those savings on to consumers and kind of keep their market share. Or the other strategy is divest. So divest means that an organization is simply going to pull out of the market if it's not profitable, or sell to someone who's willing to continue the business at lower margins. So there's two strategies for divest as well. Now, by 2016, the MP3 audio file and the related MP4 video file have been replaced largely by cloud-based streaming audio and video services, while fewer people purchase standalone MP3 players because everyone suddenly had them built into their smartphones. Now, Apple had become a leader in the new market for mobile phones with the iPhone, but lagged behind in the audio streaming market. The chief competitors here were Spotify and Deezer in audio, Netflix, Hulu, and Amazon in video. Now, both the digital file download and MP3 player were in the decline stage of the product life cycle, although Apple did continue to sell MP3 players and audio downloads to the people who still wanted them, effectively harvesting the market. So if you think back to the product lifecycle graph that we saw at the beginning of this section, you can see how the MP3 player for the iPod would have followed the graph exactly, because it went into decline when new technology came out, when the MP3 player was pretty much no longer needed, being replaced by the smartphone. Well, I hope you found this video really useful and informative, and I really hope that it helps you with your revision. If you have liked it, please be sure to like it and subscribe to our channel to make sure you keep getting these bite-sized videos repeatedly on lots of different topics to do with CIMA. And if you require any other materials such as our tuition videos, then please check out our website. Thank you so much for listening today, and good luck with your exams.